Hello and welcome to today's webinar presented by Eckerson Group and sponsored by Lelone. The topic of today will be getting started with DataOps, where Joe Hillary will be presenting foundational methods to operationalize DataOps in your organization. Before we get started and throughout the presentation, feel free to check out the attachment section for further resources. And you can also submit questions that we will try to get to at the end of the presentation. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce Joe.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for coming this morning to join us for this talk on getting started with DataOps. This is a topic near and dear to my heart, and I'm grateful to Lelone for giving me the opportunity to speak about it. Before we get going, just a few introductions. My name is Joe Hillary. I'm a research analyst with the Eckerson Group. This last fall, I was the lead author on our deep dive report examining DataOps Platforms. And a lot of the content we'll be going through today is derived from the research that went into that report. Eckerson Group is a research and consulting firm. So in addition to the reports, we also work directly with clients. And you can see here some of our recent customers. So let's get right to it. Today, we're going to try to present 10 steps that can help you get your DataOps initiative off the ground. But let's start at the beginning. Why do we need DataOps? What's wrong? Well, I probably don't need to tell you this or you wouldn't be here, but there are a lot of challenges in data analytics and data operations as it exists today. The primary issues, data solutions take too long to deploy and develop, and they have too many errors. We have more and more data than ever before, and data is more and more vital to how we run our businesses. And so these sorts of issues can cause high levels of consternation for business users. When you want the answer to a question or your dashboard breaks, this creates a lot of disconnect between data teams and business folks. So the primary issues that drive this are the vast quantities of data and the fragmentation of data landscapes. As we've started collecting more and more data from more and more systems, things like ERP or CRM tools, any number of different ways we collect data, our number of sources have expanded. In addition, the number of tools we use to analyze and work with that data, things like ETL or modeling tools, data warehouses, BI tools. Companies today typically have, dozens of tools across the stack that enter into their data pipelines or touching the data somewhere along its journey from source to business user. And so when we develop data pipelines, which are how we talk about the workflow that takes the data from its source through all of the engineering steps, through analysis, and presents it to a final data consumer, we have a lot of moving parts. And it takes a long time to get all those pieces to work together in concert, and that creates lots of opportunities for things to go wrong, for pipelines to break, for things to break down. Historically, data solutions, data-based applications have been developed on an ad hoc basis, right? So this may sound like a familiar scenario to you, but the business user comes up with a requirement, they turn to the data team, they say, hey, I need to have this kind of information in this format. And a data team sits down, they build out a new pipeline from scratch, coding that up from the base and turning it in. Maybe this is periodically updated in a waterfall style of development, similar to what we might have seen in the software world a decade ago. So this is the problem. Data takes too long, it has too many errors, and that leads to business user frustration and lack of trust in the data. So what is DataOps? Well, DataOps is a methodology that's emerged in response to these issues, and it's focused on creating rapid, reliable, and repeatable data pipelines. And essentially, it draws from agile methodologies like DevOps in the software world and tries to adopt some of those best practices and transition them to the unique challenges of the data environment. So with data, you're not only dealing with code, you're dealing with data itself, which adds a layer of complexity that doesn't have to be dealt with in the software world. But there's still many lessons that can be learned from that approach. So DataOps itself works on 3 different levels. We talk about people, process, and technology. And you've probably heard this before in reference to other things, but it's really true here. People. So this is, the folks on your team. DataOps is fundamentally about a shift in mindset and perspective, and that happens on a human level. It's also about processes, so how you go about developing things, the different practices that you implement within your organization. And of course, there's a technological component as well. And so there's certain sets of tools and technical requirements that go into building a DataOps strategy. So it's all of these pieces together that create the complete DataOps methodology. Now, at its core, DataOps builds off of DevOps and Agile, but we see sort of the trajectory of those two is about a decade or so apart, decade or two. And so you can see here, this is the evolution of DevOps. We really started seeing arguments for an Agile approach to software development coming out at the beginning of the 21st century. DevOps started becoming a term that is gaining more and more currency in the last decade. And DataOps is really still in early days. So we started to see this term emerge about 5 years ago. The DataOps Manifesto was a big moment for DataOps as a methodology and defining what that was. It was in 2017. We saw our first DataOps events just a couple of years ago. So it's following that same trajectory of widespread adoption today. Of course, DevOps is pretty ubiquitous across software. We anticipate the same sort of trajectory for DataOps in the data development world. So great, what is DataOps? Well, DataOps focuses on building 4 key pillars of capability. And so they're continuous integration, continuous delivery, orchestration, testing, and monitoring. We're gonna go through each one of those and kind of break down what they consist of. So our first component here is continuous integration, continuous delivery, and this is straight from DevOps. So we think about, rather than complete updates that roll out at set times during the year, maybe a quarterly, maybe an annual update, complete overhauls of code and pipelines. We want this to be happening all the time, constantly updated, constantly improving. No more waterfall development. So it's moving away from that system of, okay, here's a new release to continual releases. And this is facilitated by using something like a central code repository. GitHub would be a common one, particularly for software. And so thinking about maintaining those central code bases in one place where you can branch off, edit, develop, update, and then bring back in without disrupting production. It's also something that builds off of reusing old pieces. And so these are central themes I'm going to come back to throughout this presentation, but really making sure you're not reinventing the wheel every time. So finding out what you can use that you've already made, fixing it, adapting it, and bringing it back in. And the final piece is making sure you've got that seamless deployment from dev to production. So when I'm developing a new solution, a new data pipeline in development, going through QA and into production, I need that to happen very seamlessly. The next piece is orchestration. And so orchestration is incredibly important in the current data landscape. Most companies have very fractured data environments. As I mentioned at the beginning, we're looking at extraordinarily large numbers of tools and data sources, hybrid and cloud environments. Our data is all over the place. And the tools we use to work with our data aren't always the most tightly integrated. And so the way we get around this is orchestration. And so orchestration means having a central hub to manage that entire data landscape. So it's going to be you want to be able to provision environments, kick off jobs, and pass data between all of your tools from a single central hub or orchestrator. The next piece is testing, and this is really, really key to the methodology. In the software world, typically 50% of code and staff are dedicated to building tests for code. In the data world, you'd be lucky if that was at 20%. And that's a pretty big discrepancy that we see between the two environments. And it's a lot of the reason data development lags behind software development, because a lot of the time it seems like testing is more work, but makes less work in the end. When you create tests, it's validating the methods and procedures rather than going back and fixing them after the fact, which creates sort of a proactive approach to problem solving, where if you don't have to hear from your customer that there was an issue, your customer is going to be happier, and you're not going to have to take things back out of production, right? by the time it gets there, it's already been validated. And so when I say testing, I mean testing of several varieties. We're talking about testing in development, at every step of the pipeline. When something gets handed from one tool to the other, you want to test it. And so you're testing both to make sure the pipeline functions, and you're testing for data quality. And this is where this kind of deviates from what we might see in a DevOps or software environment, where you have another element, which is the data itself, and you want to test that. And that's making sure your data looks the way it's supposed to, that the data quality is there. And so you want to bake those into your pipelines when you're developing them. And then you also want to have tests both during development and production. So your tests during development are a little bit more intuitive, right? You want to make sure your code works, that your data is doing what it's supposed to be doing. And then in production, this is to make sure it continues to do so. So unlike software code, where once you release it, it's doing its thing out in the world, in the data environment, we put code out, we've built our data pipeline, but then data is flowing through it. And that data changes when things are in production, right? The code is fixed and the data changes in production. In development, typically the data is fixed and the code changes. And so we need to make sure we're testing in both environments so that all of those pieces continue to work over time. And then the final sort of core component, core capability that DataOps focuses on is monitoring. And so this is very similar to testing. But rather than thinking about the code or the data, it's looking at the infrastructure that underlies and supports all of this. So when we think about the data pipeline, the software applications you use, those are sitting somewhere on a physical machine, right? If it's in the cloud, it's in some central computer repository somewhere. Maybe it's on-prem, depending on how your organization is set up. But somewhere there is a chip, and it is running these data processes. And when you run a database application or you run a data pipeline, a computer somewhere is processing that. Monitoring is making sure that your applications are able to run efficiently on those machines. So monitoring helps you identify bottlenecks. So things around scheduling data pipelines. So if I have 100 data pipelines in production, I want to make sure those are spread out, that I have a finite amount of compute and memory resources. I'm using that as efficiently as possible. Particularly as folks move into the cloud, we see there's a real value to monitoring in terms of tracking where money goes. When you get that bill from AWS or Azure at the end of the month, it's often hard to tell where your expenditures came from, what pipelines, what applications were really driving up those expenses. And monitoring helps you do that. It'll help you understand which of your applications are the drivers of your cloud and resource drain. And then all of this information goes into helping you optimize the applications and the data pipelines themselves in order to run more efficiently and bring down the overall cost. Okay, so that's great. That's what DataOps is. Hopefully we're all kind of on the same page with that now, but that's not why you're here today. You're here to figure out how to get a DataOps initiative going at your organization. You may have already known everything that I already mentioned. This is what we're aiming to cover today. These are the steps to getting started with DataOps. You know what it is, you know you want it, how do you get there? I've divided this into two component pieces. There's organizational steps and technical steps. And so on the organizational side, those align loosely more with people and process. Technical is a little bit more technology oriented. But basically, on one side, you've got the things you need to do on the organization, and on the other, the critical technical components that go into setting up the capabilities that I just discussed. So we're just going to roll through these, starting with organizational steps. So the first one of these is educate. And this really speaks to the people component of DataOps. The number one thing you need to do is get your team on board. So your data team, your IT team, whoever is involved in touching data, from data engineers to data analysts to people who consume data, everyone needs to understand what the goal is. If you're going to start with DataOps, everyone needs to know what DataOps is. And this is as simple as sort of sitting folks down and educating them on the basic end components of DataOps, where you're trying to go with this initiative. Explain to them sort of what I've just explained to you, what it is, why it exists, what it's trying to fix, and what it's going to take to get there. You want to make sure everyone is on board, everyone is buying into the vision. If you're working on a DataOps initiative, but only you and sort of your handful of core folks understand where you're going with it, it's going to be much more difficult because DataOps is a lot about changing norms throughout the entire system. And so everyone really needs to know what's going on. So that education piece is where you got to start. Next, identify. So once you've sort of explained where you're trying to go, you want to turn this over to the folks that do the work. They're going to know where the issues are in terms of process. They're going to know what your data landscape looks like, right? Folks like engineers and analysts are using these tools day in and day out. These are their day-to-day headaches that we're trying to solve. And so you really want to empower your data teams to brainstorm and identify where are the bottlenecks in your current processes? Where do things break down? What is your current landscape, data landscape? What are you using? What are you not using? Where is it stored? What tools do people actually use on a day-to-day basis? And what's just lying around? You have that subscription, but no one's really using it. And you're going to learn this from the folks within your organization. The next step is optimize. So once you've figured out what your current situation is, right, taking stock of the landscape in terms of processes, in terms of data landscape, you want to optimize that, right? So figure out what doesn't work and then change it. It's that straightforward. So again, this is where you want to turn it over to the folks in your team. They're going to be the ones most familiar with the problems they're facing, and they're going to be the ones who are going to have the ideas to improve it. And so this is where you start to really focus on figuring out new processes, changing from things like emailing around bits of code to using a central repository, or figuring out, okay, well, when we start a new project, who is responsible for what, and really documenting. A key part of this whole process is documenting procedures. A lot of times, the things that we do in our organizations are implicit, they happen, but it's not necessarily a centralized and thought through process. And this is sort of transitioning from, hey, we have a project and we get it done however we get it done, to we have a really set procedure when we start a new project, and this is the procedure that we follow. So you want to optimize that before you convert over. So once you've optimized, you got to start somewhere, right? So once you've got your set of policies and procedures in place, go ahead and start. But don't think that's the end of the story. This is going to be a continual process of optimization. And so one of the ways you make sure that you continue to improve, and this continues to do what you want it to do, is by debriefing. So once you've started your DataOps initiative, it's not enough to just say, great, well, we talked about it, we educated everyone, and it's just going to happen. It's not. It's an iterative process. And so debriefing is a really critical part, bringing your team back together and saying, hey, what worked, what didn't work? What do we think this was going to do, and what actually happened? Finding those differences between expectation and reality, and then not being afraid to try again. This is going to be something that happens over and over again. And that's okay, because your data environment's always changing, your landscape's always changing, and so your policies, your procedures need to be able to change as well. That's part of the agile and iterative approach to this whole process, is not being afraid to try again, to try something new, to continually optimize. And then finally, monitoring. So this is a little different than the monitoring I talked about before. This is sort of monitoring for procedures, and it's related to debriefing. But it's making sure, okay, great, we have these policies, we've developed this system, is it still working? And so you want to really bake this into how your organization approaches data. Having regular check-ins with your team to figure out what's going on. Having a process, so when something breaks or someone recognizes something isn't working, there's a way for them to communicate that to the rest of the team and get something done about it. Constantly checking for it. This isn't something you can just kind of do once and put on the back burner. It's always got to be front of mind when you're thinking about the system, because as soon as one thing breaks, people are going to, A, need to fix it immediately, but B, they're going to start to doubt the efficacy of some of these practices if you're not constantly on alert, trying to repair things, trying to bring it back up to speed, and fix those things that don't work. You can't do it once and then forget about it. So those are the sort of organizational components when we think about, okay, how do we get our organization on board? How do we start sort of the people and process side of a DataOps initiative? What do we do at the beginning? How do we keep it going? The other side is a little bit more technical. And so the first piece of this is to codify everything. And so by that, I mean, treat everything as code. So obviously the code itself. And so that means using things like a repository, version control, maintaining code, branching code, copying code in a really structured and intentional way, using something like Git or another kind of repository. So you're managing code as a body that is shared across the organization, not as something that's owned by an individual coder. And so you want to automate the things that you can. So processes that you're doing manually that could be done through code or automated in another way, you want to go ahead and do that. Try to convert everything away from manual labor. And this seems relatively intuitive, but that's going to save you time. It's going to free up staff to build new pipelines, to fix problems, instead of spending time on maintaining things that are in production, doing day-to-day tasks. The more you can get those sort of mundane tasks away from your folks, the more you can automate them, the more you're really going to be able to accomplish in terms of supplying your business users with data and analytics solutions. Another piece of this is to think about data itself as code, right? So how do you approach the data? Think of it in terms of versions as well, as much as you can sort of apply those best practices from a central repository to branching, copying data and developing it, maintaining versions, identifying and tracking where your data is, who has it, sort of applying those same processes you would to code to the data as well. The next piece is really to componentize. And so this involves reusing the pieces that you have, making things into building blocks. So we see sort of an evolution with DataOps away from what we think of as artisanal analytics or artisanal data pipeline construction, where it's almost like a craftsperson. You have highly trained, highly technical, highly proficient coders, developers working on building solutions. We think of them sort of as a cowboy coder, like a lone wolf. And it may really, in practice, be a team, but that sits down and says, hey, I'm going to crank out a solution end to end. We're going to write it. And it's sort of a one person or a small group of people working on a craft, working on an artisanal solution. We want to move away from that into industrialized data analytics. And that's sort of the big jump that DataOps is taking. And a big part of that is just like moving from artisan production to factory production, making things into components, creating processes that look more like factory assembly lines than they do an artist's workshop. And so, saving the code that you can, saving the pieces. When you have 50 pipelines, there's going to be overlap. There's going to be pieces that look the same between them. And so you don't want to be writing those again and again. You want to have a central repository of these building blocks that you can pull from to copy and paste and reuse over time. And so that's going to save you development time. It means you're not going to be starting from scratch every time you want to build a new pipeline. You're going to have these pieces from which you assemble things. Sometimes we do see a little resistance from data teams. There's sort of a glory that almost goes with this cowboy coder persona of building end-to-end solutions by yourself, building end-to-end pipelines. But typically once you can get over that initial hurdle, folks see the real difference it makes on their quality of life and their quality of work, because it makes it easier in the long run. You're not worrying about late night sprints trying to really get something done. It becomes a much more sustainable way of producing data pipelines and data solutions. And folks really do see that once it gets off the ground, although there is sometimes that initial hurdle of just changing the mindset. Test. So we talked about this before. I cannot talk about this enough again. DataOps means you're embedding tests everywhere. The goal is to find errors first, and these are errors in the data and errors in the data pipelines. The last thing you want is for a business user or a customer to be the one who finds the error. You want to find it first. And the way you do that is by testing all the time. Building in tests into your data pipelines, testing the data pipelines. And what this is going to do is it's going to increase user confidence. So not only is it going to increase the quality of your products, which should, at the end of the day, be a big part of the goal, but it's going to give you the ability to show your business users why the data you present them is true. I mean, we see this issue a lot. Business users just don't trust data. They may rely on a handful of spreadsheets that they keep locally on their computer or share within their department, and they're not using the central processes. They're not using the centralized data infrastructure. And one of the ways to get them on board is by convincing them they can trust it. And you can convince them they can trust it when you can show them how the data has been tested and vetted and show where it came from, how it arrived, and over time demonstrate that the data looks the way they anticipate it should. Then you'll increase user confidence, you'll get more buy-in, and folks will be more likely to engage with those central processes going forward. Invest. So just like DevOps or any other methodology, tools make things easier. So when I say invest, you could literally buy tools, you could build tools, you could adapt tools. Those are sort of your options here. Lots of folks build tools in-house. This is particularly in the early days how a lot of this got done. We typically see someone like a DataOps engineer is an emerging persona that I'll talk a little bit more about later. But someone who is a software developer, comes from the software world, comes into an organization and starts to build infrastructure and tools that mimic those used for DevOps, but adapted for DataOps. And so, that's adopting things like Git or Jira, tools that are already in use in the DevOps environment, and then building things that are unique solutions for organization. But increasingly, as DataOps has become more mature, we see companies like Lelone out there building purpose-built DataOps tools that facilitate those key DataOps components that already exist, don't require custom development. But the goal here is really to, however you do it, create infrastructure around your data system. So you have the data landscape itself, all the tools that make up your data pipelines, and this is thinking sort of around that space. What are the tools that you use to build the machine, right? So you're building that machine that builds the machine. And here, really what you put in is what you get out. The more that you invest and build these systems, the easier it's going to be to maintain them. In the long run, the easier it is to get people to use and follow the DataOps approach. It's the difference between trying to break a board with your hands and using a saw. So this is a key component, but you want to think really intentionally about how you're investing. And so that's where this piece evaluating comes in. And so it's thinking about what tools do you have? Do they do what you need them to do? Are needs being met within your organization, within sort of your DataOps initiative? Do you have all 4 components? Do you have gaps within that system? Are there things where parts of it fall through? Are there aspects that need more support or less support? And alternatively, do you need all of the things that you have, right? Are there the things that are going unused or features that you don't really need that you could replace, and sort of refining what it is that you're using, what it is that you need, and adjusting to reflect that. And so this is a process of continuous refinement. Just like monitoring your policies, you need to be continually evaluating your tools, your infrastructure, making sure that that's doing what it needs to be doing, no more, no less. And so this is a really key component for your DataOps engineer. And so this is, as I mentioned, is a persona that's coming out. We've seen emerging in the industry in the last year, 2 years, which is a dedicated person to oversee and think about the DataOps environment and infrastructure. And so this is a technical person, but they're the ones who are going to be managing these DataOps tools. They're the ones who are going to be managing the policy, thinking about DataOps as their day-to-day role. And so they're really critical for this process of evaluation and making sure the needs of the team are being met. So one of the quickest ways to kind of get up and running with some of these DataOps features, establishing those 4 key functionalities, is to use something like a DataOps platform. And this is a relatively recent development in the industry where we see vendors producing platforms specifically to support the DataOps functions. And so the diagram you see here is actually a diagram of a modern data pipeline. So that arrow going through the middle is the pipeline itself. So on one side, it's connected to data source. On the other end, it's connected to business users. It's flowing through ingestion, engineering, analytics on the way. So obviously this is a hugely simplified pipeline, but the idea is it's going through these phases, right? And it's supported underneath by technical tools, things like ingestion engines, integration tools, preparation tools, and analytics tools. So anything from ETL to BI falls down here. And so we've seen numbers of tools developed for specific purposes, right? That's probably the most common way a product enters the market is, okay, this is a master data management tool, or this is a data quality and cleansing tool. And we also see platforms that package many of those together. But this is the sort of technical components of your data pipeline, what makes up the pipeline itself. Now, on top of this, we have the DataOps components. So, our development, deployment, orchestration, testing, and monitoring pieces. And so what's new, we've had platforms addressing the bottom of the stack increasingly over time. We now have platforms addressing the top, where they're trying to provide the capabilities you need for DataOps. And that can save you a lot of time rather than developing your own solutions in-house to try to implement these 4 pillars. You can start to buy products that aim to facilitate that off the shelf. And so one example of that, of course, is the Lelone Arena platform. And so this is one of a handful of DataOps platforms I examined in the report that I wrote this fall. So I'm just going to talk really briefly kind of sort of what this does. And so the Lelone Arena platform, first off, focuses on providing kind of all the pieces of a data pipeline up to the point of analytics. So it's not a BI tool, but it's going to provide things like ingestion, integration, preparation. So you can build out pipelines fully within the tool. And then what's really critical for our conversation today are these top features, right? So it's a tool that allows you to embed tests in those pipelines. You can deploy and develop within the tool. And the really critical piece here is orchestration. So tools like Lelone manage those complex environments, right? So I spoke about orchestration before. Something like this is really, really critical when you have a complex data landscape. If you're dealing with, a handful of sources and a handful of tools, it gets complicated really quickly. Your data pipelines, don't look nearly so linear, right? They're going all over the place and they're touching lots of different software solutions. Lots of different folks are responsible for different sections of it. An orchestration tool like Lelone kind of brings all of that together into one place. It creates that central hub for all of your data pipelines, where you can manage them, build them, develop them, deploy them, and it will manage all of your other tools as well. So it's all about sort of extensibility here. So with Lelone, you can build things using the tools that they provide, or you can integrate with all of the tools you already use and mix and match between them. And that's sort of that key orchestration piece, keeping the entire landscape together as you build out your data pipelines. Okay, well, I hope this has been helpful to you, and you sort of have a better sense now of what DataOps is, how to get a DataOps initiative off the ground in your organization, the different pieces that go into that, and then sort of what a DataOps platform is, where you're going with that, sort of what a platform like Lelone can provide. With that, I'd like to go ahead and turn it over to questions. I look forward to hearing from you all.
Thank you, Joe. That was amazing. We do have a couple of questions from the audience already, and feel free to submit more as we go through them. The first one that I see here, how does DataOps work with hybrid or multi-cloud environments?
Thank you. Yeah, that's a really great question. So cloud has been a huge trend, obviously, in the last few years, and it's really accelerated in this past year. As folks have been working from home with the coronavirus, we've seen companies that, even 3 years ago wouldn't have considered moving off-prem, starting to see the value of cloud deployments. And what that does is it increases the complexity of data landscapes, right? It's rare that someone is moving from on-prem to the cloud. Typically, they're adding cloud. And this creates really complicated environments. We also see folks that are using multiple cloud providers, right? So AWS and Azure, depending on the line of business. And that's where sort of platforms and orchestrators are really key. You could do things like build out your own solutions that try to integrate between all these, but what you'd really like to find is a tool that's platform agnostic. And so that's kind of when you're evaluating DataOps platform, something you want to look for. Is this a tool that's going to orchestrate across clouds? So DataOps totally works and is actually even more important when you're dealing with those complex environments. But the key is making sure that the tools you're using, particularly in the orchestration side, are able to manage all of those different environments.
Great, thank you, Joe. The next question here, how do you recommend addressing the people component of DataOps?
Great, that's an excellent question. So the people component, like I said, it's a team effort. And so it's really thinking about getting everyone on board, getting everyone's buy-in. This isn't something that's going to happen just because a director of analytics says we should have DataOps. It's about winning over your team, sort of convincing them of the strengths of this approach. And then the other sort of big people component I'll talk about is building that team, right? So your team consists obviously of your engineers, your analysts, your data consumers, everyone who's touching data at any point in its life cycle. But something that's sort of new with DataOps is the idea of a dedicated DataOps engineer, which I referenced a bit earlier. And this is a persona that vendors are increasingly thinking about as they create DataOps tools, as the person who's going to be using those tools, managing the infrastructure for your data environment, managing the tools that you use to build your data pipelines, and managing your processes. And so having someone like a DataOps engineer who's a technical developer, someone with experience, typically they come from the software world and they've experienced DevOps there. Other times, there's someone like a data engineer who has just really been thinking a lot about these issues, sees it on a day-to-day basis, and is sort of expanding outside of that role. A DataOps engineer can be a dedicated person, and that would be my personal recommendation, is to say, have someone own your DataOps initiative, have someone own this project, because it is a full-time task to do it. Right now, that's something that's transitioning. Typically, at the moment, we see those responsibilities spread across a handful of employees within a data team, and that is another way to do it. But the more you can sort of have a consistent vision that's getting communicated to all of those component parts, I think that's more effective.
Great. All right, we will do one more question live, and then if you've submitted another question, we will follow up with you after the webinar, but we'll have time for one more. So how are companies measuring DataOps success?
Great, that's a really excellent question. So success, I think, comes by how you're solving the two problems I showed at the beginning, right? So how long is it taking you to build out your pipelines? Is this a month-long process when you try to build up a new solution or a new application? Or is this something that's taking weeks or even days? Can you show that it's faster? And the other piece ties back into testing. So I've been kind of hammering this point home. Testing is so critical for DataOps. And one of the reasons is because it gives you evidence to show that your initiative is working. So by testing at every stage of the pipeline, you can see the difference between when you start and as you become more proficient in your DataOps processes. You can see, okay, how frequently are our pipelines breaking? How many errors are there in our data? These are things that you can track over time because the tests are giving you insights. And you can compare those errors and breakage rates and document the improvement that has come along with your DataOps initiative. So kind of those two pieces, I would say, test results and project durations. Is it faster? Is it better quality? And then the other piece you could look at as well is, we talk about better, faster, cheaper, right? And so things like monitoring that are increasing your efficiency, sort of all the different pieces that are speeding up should allow you to do more with less, right? So you could look at things like your cloud bills and say, hey, before we had DataOps, before we were sort of monitoring all these pieces and able to tell what was going on, we were spending this much a month in AWS, and now we're spending this much. So looking at how the increased efficiency of resource usage impacts your expenses as well. It's another way to look at and measure that success. So testing results, project durations, and the expense of your pipelines in production.
That's perfect. And just a reminder, within the attachment section, you can actually find a DataOps ROI calculator that'll kind of give you a rough estimate on those success metrics. And then also in that attachment section, you will find the DataOps deep dive report, as well as a blog on getting started with DataOps, both authored by Joe. So with that, I say thank you to everyone, and that concludes our webinar today, and I hope you enjoyed.